after it was published in 92, I probably found it at about 93 or 4. And you can say more about that. There's Mr. Nagel. Now, let me back up a little bit here. I'll describe a little bit of the map here. Kennedy took off from Washington on September 24th, which would have been a Tuesday. And he went to Milford, Pennsylvania, which was a national wildlife refuge. And actually, the person that he met there as the first stop on his conservation tour of 1963 was Mary Pinchot Meyer. And apparently there was a relationship, and I don't know if that's why he picked that place to stop, because she was going to be there, but at any rate, it was a fitting place to kick off the tour, because Pinchot had been instrumental in setting up natural areas in the United States, and helping Teddy Roosevelt, I suppose, start the national parks movement. So I don't know how long he spent there, but he soon flew on to Duluth, which you see right at the tip of what would be Lake Superior, and he landed there. And his plan was to stay overnight, but then he took a helicopter out to Ashland, Wisconsin, about 60 miles away. And Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin was interested in getting JFK to designate some islands off of the coast of the Wisconsin coast of Lake Superior as a national seashore. So he flew Kennedy out on the helicopter. They flew over so Kennedy could see what he was getting involved in, and it did become a national seashore fairly soon after that. They landed in Ashland, and the dot is a little off there. It should be closer to the water, the finger of red that sticks down there. And he gave a speech there. There's now an airport there named after him. About a year ago, I talked to the mayor and said, hey, is there any commemoration of JFK in Ashland, Wisconsin? He says, oh yeah, it's our airport's name. So the point being, every place Kennedy went, there's a bridge, an airport, a street that seemingly more often than not gets named after him. So they left Ashland, they went back to Duluth to stay for the night. He stayed back in the day, a downtown 5-star hotel, and he stayed on the 10th floor, and it was a corner room. You could look down the coast of Lake Superior. It was probably the most expensive room in the city of Duluth, Minnesota, which is where Bob Dylan hails from, by the way. And I stood in the room. I got it now had been converted into a senior living center, but back in the day had that huge lobby and just a spectacular hotel. And I looked out the window, and it was like the glass met at the corner, and you could see this broad vista that they wanted Kennedy to have the privilege of staying in. They even brought a rocker and had it in the room so he'd feel at home. And the head of security in Duluth, when he was going to speak that night at the University of Minnesota Duluth, a branch of the main campus in Minneapolis, the head of security told me that the 11th floor and the 9th floor had been cleared out of any tenants because they were afraid that a bomb might go off above or below his room. And they had food tasters in the kitchen. Now, you almost have to assume this happens in every presidential visit, but it seemed like this security was on steroids. And the arena that he spoke in a few miles from the hotel, the person in charge of security said it was locked down so tight, there was no way anybody could get in that wasn't going through the main doors. So he gave his speech and back to the hotel. He flew out the next morning to go to Grand Forks, North Dakota, which was across the state of Minnesota, about 275 miles. And he landed in Grand Forks at an air base that I'll show a location of in a little bit here. And then choppered the 13 miles into Grand Forks. Now, this was a nuclear base. It didn't have Minuteman missiles at the time, but B-52 nuclear loaded bombers. And I found out later that the night before, the U.S. Congress had passed the bill for the nuclear treaty, nuclear test ban treaty. And I look back at his speech years later, and he never mentioned it. Here was the high point, maybe you could say at that point in his presidency, about what, 930 days in, and he didn't mention it. And I thought that was curious. Of course, I didn't remember the speech until I looked at it years later. And I asked Ted Sorensen, who was at a conference in Grand Forks that John Williams here had set up with his colleagues. And I had numerous times during the weekend to talk to Ted Sorensen. And I said, why didn't JFK talk about the test ban treaty that was signed the day before he was in North Dakota? He says, well, I wasn't along, but he started talking about it soon after. And later I found soon after meant that afternoon when he flew on to the next city and decided that he was kind of bored with the conservation spiel that he was giving, even though it was important to him. Now he's preoccupied with the test ban treaty passage, and he puts away the conservation speech and ad-libs an anti-nuclear speech and basically an anti-war speech. So Sorensen was totally aware of that, even though he wasn't on the trip. And I thought that was quite significant. Now, getting back to my original mention of breaching security at this arena, I'll go on here. Now here's Duluth in the blue arrow, Grand Forks in the yellow arrow, so you get a geographical sense of where these places are. You're probably familiar with Winnipeg up there in Canada below or above the yellow arrow. By the way, that's where William Stevenson, the British American spy, hails from, that became the model for 007. About 2 hours from the yellow arrow. Here's the yellow arrow, shows the nuclear base, and you can see it's all farmland. The blue arrow is the university where he choppered from Air Force One at the air base, and would have been a 13-mile motorcade with no, you can see, just open land, so that didn't make sense to do that. Now, again, the blue, I'll tell you what the blue arrow is in a little bit. The yellow arrow is where his limo parked in front of the door to the arena and where he was able to be escorted into the staging area where he was going to receive an honorary degree. The yellow X marks the spot where his helicopter landed, and that was a grass field back in the day. So those trees running back and forth didn't exist. The field, which you can see is a full block long and a block wide, was surrounded by those 10,000 people that couldn't get in. This is a little closer view. Now, the white building to the right of the football field didn't exist then. There was no street between the football field and the yellow arrow. The large parking ramp across from the X didn't exist. So there's the yellow arrow pointing to the door that JFK went in. This was what they called a field house. It had a dirt floor so they could have track and field events, but it was also the basketball court. It had swimming pools, handball courts. It was a totally single destination athletic facility for all the students on campus. Now, the significance of the blue arrow that's been showing up is that a few years ago, it occurred to me that there might be a place from which a shooter might want to might be able to take a shot. And that parking lot didn't exist. It was just a grassy area. I delivered papers to that tower back in 59, 60, and 61. And there were students living in that tower, main floor, second floor, third floor. And I would go up to the top of that tower every day where the blue arrow is and deliver a paper to a Canadian hockey player who I knew for the rest of my life until he passed away 3 years ago. In Duluth, by the way. And I said to him about 3 years ago, were you asked to leave your room by any chance on September 25th, 1963? He says, no. And you'll see the significance of that later, the fact that he wasn't. He could have been, but he wasn't. There's the door JFK went in. Now his limo stopped right in front of that door. Yellow arrow is the door. That 4-lane road didn't exist, or that bridge, that skyway you see straight ahead, which is meant to connect a couple parking ramps. Okay, let me back up a little bit here. That gives you a rough outline of the turf that I'm trying to describe. Now, Nagel in El Paso on September 20th, 1963, from 445 and 48, and the man who knew too much. When I saw this in about 94 in Russell's book, I said to myself, now when did I see Kennedy? I'd forgotten the date. And when I saw that it was September 20th that Nagel got arrested, I said, that's just 5 days before I saw Kennedy. What's Nagel saying? As you see, someone, he says, was waiting for him across the border in Juarez from El Paso. But Nagel had come to a decision. He cruised the streets for a while, then parked his Ford Fairlane next to a no parking sign in the alley between Oregon and El Paso streets. Then he walked into the downtown post office. He was going to shoot into the ceiling in the post office, but it was too crowded. So he walked to a bank across the street, and that's where he ended up putting 2 bullets in the ceiling just above the wall. And he then left, walked a short distance to his car, and started to drive away when policeman Officer Bundren intercepted him, and Nagel said, I guess you got me, it's over, and didn't resist arrest. Now, if you've read the book, you know that he had been instructed to either convince Oswald that he was being set up in the JFK conspiracy, and or he was supposed to kill Oswald in Mexico City and then take residence abroad. So the story is the Russians had since he was a double agent, they had used his participation in New Orleans and other places, and they apparently discovered that the Russians had discovered the plot and felt that they were going to be framed in order to stimulate an attack on Cuba. So when I saw that, of course, for me, the plot started to thicken, and I kept trying to synchronize the day I saw him with Nagel's experience. So here's an affidavit in Russell's book. I won't read all that. I don't know if everybody can see it if they don't have. Anybody can't see it?
No, we can see it fine, Gary.
Okay. So Nagel says, I indicated that the attempt would take place during the latter part of September, probably on the 26th through the 29th, presumably at Washington, D.C. Now, this is what he's included in the letter to Hoover. And he goes on to say, a short piece later, you can see 9/24/63 on the left there. I surmise that these numerals might stand for a date, September 24th, 63. And I flash back, this is excuse me, this is Dick Russell talking now. And I flash back to Nagel's warning letter to Hoover, which specifically stated that the assassination plot involving Oswald was, to his knowledge, for the 24th or the 29th of September. Well, that lit me up, of course, because I'm right there on the 25th. Not only am I there on the 25th, but my friend Bruce and I, 16-year-olds, snuck in the back door. But we had to go through 4 sets of doors, and there was no security. There was a sharpshooter on the roof. We were surprised that these doors were open. They actually went into the part of the building where the coaches had offices. It was a big trophy lobby. And the 15,000 people were going in on the other side of the building. Well, Kennedy, by the time we went through those doors, hadn't landed. He probably landed in his helicopter just a few minutes after we went through those doors. Everybody, by the time we got through 4 sets of doors, had filled the arena. And we went up this back stairway, past some handball courts, past offices. And there was one door left into the arena that we knew would take us into the far end of the actual arena. A steel door, well, we thought that's got to be locked. It was open. We scanned, we saw 2 empty seats right in front of the podium where Kennedy would speak. You know, there's a 30-foot gap. And I joked today when I taught students at JFK High School, when I talk about this, that I said to my buddy, hey, those are our seats. And we made our way through the crowd, took 10 minutes, and there was a Secret Service agent standing right in front of the seats, scanning the crowd. We had to actually squeeze by him to get into the 2 seats. Didn't even look at us. Now, between that scene and Duluth, with the high security in place, as I think we know now, Kennedy was being stalked. I mean, if they clean out the rooms above and below his room in Duluth on the 10th floor, that might mean more than your average security process. So this is the tie-in that my story kind of depends on in order to make this plausible. Now, why is this significant? Well, as I mentioned to Tony and Bart last Saturday when we were doing a test run, your last 2 issues of your journal have Dr. Paul Blue from the University of Ottawa with two very long, I'd say 12 to 15 page articles about alternative plots before Dallas. And of course, everybody knows about Chicago, Tampa, Miami, Los Angeles. But this one, I contend, has the evidence that Nagel was privy to the end of September being a likely scenario. He just didn't know that Kennedy was going on a conservation tour from the 24th to the 29th. And once it didn't happen in Washington, I think the end of September scenario kind of got pushed out of the view of the public, and it was only somebody like me who grew up kind of like an embedded reporter in this, where this event took place in Grand Forks, would notice some details. It has nothing to do with my ability to do research. It was just a long series of having pieces of the puzzle feed into a scenario that I never forgot. It was an indelible memory for a 16-year-old to be standing and sitting in front of Kennedy after having to work that hard to sneak through the back doors and then 2 months later have him assassinated. Of course, at the time, I had no idea what the connection was, but it continued to percolate in the back of my mind. And I, of course, was doing a lot of reading over the years, and things started to fall into place. So this project really is about adding to Paul Blue's description of plots leading up to Dallas. And the idea being, if there's a pattern, does it give us a better sense of who might have been involved? Any questions at this point? Have I lost?
No, this is great stuff, Gary. It's amazing the lack of security that you're telling me. I'm absolutely flabbergasted. Does anybody have any questions they want to ask at this point? Just unmute yourself.
Okay.
We'll have a question.
Is there a question?
I don't hear anything. Gary, do you want to go ahead?
Okay.
And I'll keep an eye on the chat room.
Okay. Now this book apparently is worth about $100 these days. I got it for 25 cents in a garage sale in South Minneapolis about 15 years ago. And it has a piece that I was able to use another verification piece. And you see there, I've written in Wednesday morning in Grand Forks, North Dakota, 9/25/63 at the University of North Dakota Fieldhouse. And it says on September 25th, he, JFK, declared, "We must today prepare for those who are our heirs. The steps we take in conservation and reclamation will have very little effect upon all of us here immediately and in this decade. What we are doing in the real sense is preparing for those who come after us." Well, he was in the paragraph above that. He said, "I don't know why it should be that 6 or 7% only of the whole Atlantic coast should be in the public sphere and the rest owned by private citizens and denied to many millions of our fellow citizens." Well, of course, his family was one of that wealthy class that owned a lot of coastline in Massachusetts and Florida. So he was being a little self-critical there because the environment was already in the front of his presidency. So I saw that, and I went back to his speech and saw that this was what he did say in Grand Forks. Of course, the date was significant, but this is the paragraph that he decided he didn't want to say when he flew on to the next location in Billings, Montana, where he decided instead to start talking about the nuclear issues. And Ted Sorensen told me that's when he found the theme for his 1964 campaign reelection. So that, coming from Ted Sorensen, I guess that's pretty accurate. And this is also on page 298, as you see. A representative of the committee followed the president's trips at the end of September through Wisconsin, North Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, Washington, Utah, Oregon, Nevada, and California. Apparently, the committee planned to assassinate Kennedy first in Chicago and then in Florida the week before his trip to Texas. But both times the Secret Service was alerted. The Chicago trip was canceled. That's what, October 13th. And special precautions were taken in Miami. The president used a helicopter. Committee would have preferred to act in Florida, but it had its doubts about the reliability of the Florida State Police and the Tampa, Miami police departments. And the operation was postponed until Dallas on November 22nd. Well, that's all true, but the committee was, at least in another place, a member of the committee was following Kennedy. Now, I have always had to ask myself, were those doors open that day that my friend and I went through? And in order to maybe see what security would be like. Now, remember, on the 20th, Nagel had himself arrested because he thought the assassination was going to happen the 24th through the 29th. And there's a member of the committee, which is, according to Farewell America, which I realize has its issues with veracity, but that is a detail in the book that is accurate. So if Nagel was right that it was going to happen on the 24th, 5th through the 29th, then what were the plotters obviously alerted to Nagel's throwing a monkey wrench into the process, and they canceled it. And all they could do was just follow and check up on security. Yeah. Okay. This man, Dr. John Penn, was a professor of speech at the University of North Dakota. He lived a few blocks from where I grew up. My 6 younger brothers and sisters knew his kids better than I did. He was the liaison between the White House and the university. Once they had planned the University of North Dakota to be a stop on the conservation tour, he became the person in charge of security. And can you still hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, we can hear you fine, Gary. Go ahead.
Okay. He was 90 years old in about 2005. When I was 5 hours away in Minneapolis, I drove up to see my mother, sat down, picked up the local paper, and here was a huge story on the 45th anniversary of Kennedy's visit. And in the story, Dr. Penn was described as the head of security. I knew who he was, but I didn't know that was his role. I called him up. I said, could we meet? I've got a couple of questions for you. So we went to a Ramada Inn. And in fact, I had John Armstrong's book with me because there was a piece in Harvey and Lee that related to Oswald appearing in North Dakota. So I thought I'd say, you know, what do you think of this? But then my real question was, why were those doors open the morning of September 25th, 1963? Now he's 90. He had moved to the West Coast. He had gotten divorced. He had come back. He could have been dead 30 years ago. So here he was, and his response was, well, I don't know, maybe the custodian left the doors open. And we made small talk for an hour, a couple hours to reacquaint ourselves with our experience in North Dakota. I came back 2 months later, called him up. So John, or Dr. Penn, have you thought any more about my question? And without much hesitation, he said, well, you know, I gave the keys to the Secret Service that morning at 7:30. Those doors should have been locked when you went through them. 4 sets of doors, remember. Now, I would bet money that he knew that answer when I asked him 2 months earlier. He just wasn't sure he should answer me, even though I had, you know, credibility living in the neighborhood as a kid. So we talked more, and, you know, I'm not really thinking about what his involvement is beyond giving the keys to the Secret Service. I go back 2 months later. This time he says, come to my house. It's actually an apartment on the edge of the University of North Dakota. And I didn't think anything of it. I knocked on the door. He opens the door, and there's 2 dining room chairs sitting inside the door. They're not in the dining room. They've been placed. There's barely room for the one that abuts the door frame to be there without tripping over it. He says, sit down. So I sit down, and he immediately sits down next to me, leans over, looks me in the eye, and says, you don't think I was involved, do you? And, you know, if I'd been a seasoned investigative reporter back in 2005, I would have probably been able to do something with that, but I was so taken aback, I simply said, no, Dr. Penn, I don't think, not even that excitedly, just no, I don't think so. End of conversation. He got the answer he wanted. If I had said anything else, I'm sure the fact that he had put the door right, or the chair right by the door, meant that he could at least have a chance of pushing me out. If I said, yeah, if you gave the keys to the Secret Service and you were the liaison, et cetera, seems to me you know more than you're you know, if I'd said that, I would have been kicked out. But again, a seasoned reporter might have been able to avoid that. And I don't think that he expected me to come back a second and third time, being I live 5 hours away. And he was just kind of doing limited hangouts until the end. Now, I've told a local journalist who knew him, that he said that, and they just kind of said, he's probably talking about something else. Well, you had to, I mean, the whole context says more than that. Now, about a month ago, a friend I grew up with that lives in San Diego, very accomplished symphony orchestra member, we got talking, and I said, did your parents, the professors at the university, ever know John Penn? Yeah, during the McCarthy era, he was kind of on that side, but he never bugged my parents about their liberal views. And he said he was a Goldwaterite, maybe even a Bircher. And all these years, I had thought that Dr. Penn was likely a liberal UND professor. And this was the first time I had seen him referred to as a right-winger. So what was he doing in charge of security? And, you know, I think I've got some ideas, but here he is training students to be ushers, etc., for September 25th. By the way, he would never talk to me about Kennedy again. It's like I didn't even mutter the word JFK. What else can you tell me? He would change the subject. It was totally taboo to go there. It's like I didn't even say it. Now, you see this football stadium. It's presently just a practice field. That white building next to it wasn't there. At the time, it was actively used. And one of the people that ran what they call buildings and grounds at the university, when I asked him about 15 years ago, what was the scene like from your perspective? He said that running track around the football field, which you could fit probably 4 vehicles abreast, was covered with state police, highway patrol, city police, you name it, all the way around the track, 4 deep. Now there was a wall around it, so you couldn't see them. I didn't know that until 15 years ago. So again, just like Duluth, Minnesota, 24 hours earlier, security was on high alert. And yet I went through 4 sets of doors. Maybe the Secret Service just forgot to lock the doors, or the thing is, that stairway that I went up through 4 sets of doors, inside the last door was a steel ladder that led to a catwalk that went right over the podium. Well, what's the movie Parallax View, I think, that has that scenario where somebody's up on the catwalk and it becomes a perch from which to shoot the president? It was just too crowded. I don't think that, I mean, they could have been up there, but of course it had been canceled 5 days earlier anyway. Any questions at this point? Reactions?
Let me just unmute everybody, Gary.
Okay.
Okay, so everybody's now unmuted. Is there anything that people want to ask? Well, obviously, we're very interested in any comments that you may have.
No, I don't have any questions. I'm really happy with the way this is flowing and this whole Zoom experience overall. It's very good. So
Yeah.
That's all I got to say. Thank you very much, Gary.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting. Gary, just keep going.
Okay. Now, Mr. Penn, Dr. Penn, in the article in the Grand Forks Herald on the 45th anniversary, he said the funniest, unusual part of that day in terms of my security experience was that I forgot to give the president of the university his credentials, which would allow him to escort Kennedy through that large door with his limo parked right outside the door. And recently I've thought, especially when I discovered that he was a conservative Republican pro-Goldwater type, and maybe even a Bircher. Everybody knows what John Birch Society is. It's the ultra-right group that's probably most powerful in Dallas, but was all over the country, including Grand Forks. And so he said the funniest thing was that I forgot to give the credentials to the president of the university. He said, I ran across the arena to get the credentials to him. Now, what does that tell you? This is what caused me to think, is there any place somebody could have thought about shooting from? Well, that tower in the football stadium. Probably a 200-foot distance. Now, what does that tell you? If he had to run across the arena through a crowd to deliver credentials, it meant that Kennedy was standing outside the limo with the governor of North Dakota and a US senator stationary, perfect target from someplace, could be that tower. That's just pure speculation. But it just does not compute. I mean, yeah, you forget to give the president of the university his credentials. But when he told me inside his apartment, sitting on those 2 dining room chairs, that he wanted to know if I thought he was involved or not, that becomes more significant at that point, because, you know, there's the scenario that compartmentalization happens for events like this, and that there's only a need to know basis. And so his job is to get Kennedy stationary. How do you do that? You don't give the president of the university his credentials. So you got a 5-minute delay. Now, I don't know that Kennedy got out of the limo or if he was still sitting in it, but either way, he's stationary. He's only had to drive a block in the limo. He has 2 state officials on either side of him, kind of like Governor Connolly in Dallas. And you'll see some other significant pictures here. These pictures are from the University of North Dakota archives of Kennedy's visit, and freely accessible. So here he is getting off the chopper. That's the governor of North Dakota on the left, and right behind Kennedy is a Senator Burdick, both Democrats. Obviously, Kennedy would feel right at home with them. Getting into the limo. Now you can see other helicopters in the background, press helicopters. It was quite the scene. These, at the time, at 16, I had never seen helicopters that big. It just kind of blew me away to have 4 or 5 helicopters land all at once in that field. Now, who does that driver look like to you guys?
Greer.
Any guesses?
Greer.
Greer?
Yep,
Yeah,
that's Greer,
Bill Greer.
who's driving in Dallas, right? Everybody.
Yeah.
Now this is on the way to the arena entrance. There's that tower. Like I say, I went up there every day for 3 years to deliver a paper to the guys that lived up there. Now you can see the crowd going into the main doors. Where the X is where I went through with my friend Bruce. The doors were open. Nobody was, you'd think if somebody had tried that door, everybody would have seen that it was open, and they would have started trying to get into the arena through there, because it would take you onto the floor of the arena. But all these folks wouldn't know that unless they were a 16-year-old kid trying to.
Gary, is the door that Kennedy went through to the right of that image then? The main door?
No, Kennedy went through on the other side of the building. So if you went to the yellow X, beyond the yellow X, you'd go around the corner, and it'd be about 100 or so feet to that large door that I showed in the previous slides. So I'm not there yet, because when I got there, all these people had already gone in. So when I got in through the 4 open doors, the place was packed. Everybody had gotten in. So this is what it looked like as they were doing that. The guy on the right, I wish I knew who that was, with his arms folded. Either he's totally amazed that he's there at that moment, or he doesn't like Kennedy. I don't know.
He looks totally unimpressed, Gary.
Yeah. Now this is, you can see the bricks in the background. This is as they're pulling up to the side of the building where that door is. I don't know who the photographer was at the university, but he got some great shots. Now that building in the background is not the arena. That is a student center, student union, as they refer to it. Now, I don't know if that's Greer to the left with the glasses and the crew cut. Definitely Secret Service around him, though.
For sure.
There's the stadium wall. Just to the left would be that tower.
Sorry to interrupt. The previous picture, you can distinguish the Secret Service agents because of the badges on their lapels. There's 3 badges. You see 3 individuals in suits with little things on their lapel here.
Right. Yeah,
that's their way of recognizing as Secret Service agents.
And
Right.
the haircut as well.
Pardon? Peter?
And the haircut as well.
Right, right. Well, yeah, when I and my friend had to squeeze past the agent standing in front of the 2 empty chairs, I remember looking up at him sideways and seeing this maroon glassy button on his lapel. And never forget that, because I found out later that it has to be the right color that day in order to keep any imposters from infiltrating.
Oh. Interesting.
Now that looks like Greer to me on the left in the sunglasses as he was driving. Now that tower in the back is the other end of the stadium. It's not the same tower, but it looks like it's a doable shot also. If Nagel was right that it was going to happen at the end of September. There's even a rail yard in the background, just like Dealey Plaza. Large rail yard, a little further away, but. Now, again, I mentioned that it felt like as the years passed, I had been like an embedded investigator, even though I wasn't. I knew these 2 gentlemen, the short one on the right and the one behind him. I grew up with their kids. I grew up in a neighborhood full of university professors. So I was really always hearing about their university activities. Now here's the route that my friend and I took to get from the last of the 4 doors we had to go through. If you follow that left-hand arrow up into the balcony, there'd be a door there. Today it's been cemented over, but you can still sense where it is because the cement blocks are different. And the X is where the podium is. Kennedy came in by the red arrow, and I was sitting to the left of the arrow where the 2 empty seats were. And it took me 40 years to find out why those 2 seats were empty. And I was with a subsequent president of the university whose kids I grew up with. And we were standing at a construction site on campus. This is about 1978, probably. And I told him my story. He was an ex-Marine, very popular as a president. And I said, you know, there were these empty seats. He says, oh, those were mine. He said, I had to give a speech in Western North Dakota that day to a convention of cities. And I didn't give my free tickets away. The first 20 rows were basically free tickets, but you had to have one. And yet we didn't have a ticket and the agent let us sit down. If we'd been 30 years old, I doubt if he would have. But, you know, what luck. And then to find out why they were empty 40 years later was crazy. Here's the press. Numerous people in here lived in my neighborhood, so I grew up with their children. Like the media event. Now, I was just to the right. Sadly to say, I wasn't in the picture. That would have been better if I had been. When Kennedy came in, the first, I'd say 20 rows were a lot of female college students. And you'd think the Beatles had come in. They jumped on their chairs. It was total hysteria. They were crying. They were pulling their hair, screaming. I could not believe it. It was, I mean, talk about a president that's a rock star. It was amazing. Now, I think there's some U.S. congressman with him on the trip. The guy on the left, I know he's, that's who he is. And so you can tell they're kind of familiar with each other. And there's the president of the university, I think probably just introducing him. We're getting ready to let him take over the microphone. Now that president of the university, again, I was fortunate to live on the edge of campus. I delivered his paper every day to his office for 3 years, and on Sunday morning to his house, and he'd invite me in for breakfast, especially if there was a blizzard going on. And he was originally from the East Coast, or at least Ohio, and taught me a lot about what universities were about. You see Kennedy in the robe there. He hasn't, either he's been at the podium at this point. People are leaving the stage. There he's getting his honorary Doctor of Laws. So even today, when you go to various places in this town, which over 180 years it's had to grow, it's still only about 60,000 people because it's so damn cold. People leave, like John Williams. He put up with it for 40 years, but at some point it was just too difficult. I'm still in Minneapolis where it's still tundra.
Better tundra.
Better tundra. Okay, I've got some, I'll tantalize you with these pictures. Now, could this be a light table where they're trying to decide how to publish the February '64 Life cover with Oswald in the backyard? I'll tell you more, but let's go back a bit here. Any reactions at this point?
Again, this is going to unmute everybody. These are great photographs, Gary.
Yeah, these colored ones, of course, I got off Google, and I thought they'd be, because this is such an obscure, abstract event that takes a lot of orientation to make a presentation make sense. And it was my playground as a kid, so it's kind of special to me.
Yeah.
Now, getting back to the map, I mean, if Nagel thought it was the 24th to the 29th, it could have been in any of these cities. And for all I know, there's a story like mine in some of those places. Don't know that. Now, he left Grand Forks at about noon after giving his conservation speech. And I think he went to Billings before Laramie and Cheyenne. But this is an Interior Department film, so I could be wrong. At any rate, you're familiar with the name Vince Palomera, who's the expert on the Secret Service?
Yeah.
He tells me that when he left Grand Forks and went to Billings and gave his anti-nuclear war speech, they spent the night at Jackson Hole, the Grand Teton National Park. Spectacular park, as you've probably seen pictures of. And Vince Palomera says it was at that point that the White House agreed to extend the Texas trip to include Dallas. Now, I don't know if that means that they were just going to go to Fort Worth or if they weren't going to go to Fort Worth, Dallas at all until September 25th. Now, of course, when one thinks about it, could it be that because Nagel had blown their cover 5 days earlier, that they needed to make sure that the White House would agree to go to Dallas instead of just Houston, San Antonio, etc. So that was quite a discovery that fit my puzzle for Palomera to discover. And I really don't know about any, Hanford is the nuclear weapons development site in Washington on the Columbia River. They don't test weapons there, but obviously he would go there. And it'd be interesting to know how he talked about his experience there when the same day or the next day he's starting to formulate his 64 campaign that is largely about preventing nuclear war. Don't know that. Now, I wasn't sure this. We've been at it about an hour. We still got time?
Yeah, absolutely. Keep going, Gary.
Okay. The plot thickens when we talk about H.L. Hunt and Bunker Hunt, his son. Bunker Hunt, I don't know that this is common knowledge in England, but he and his brothers cornered the silver market back in the 70s, and they owned a professional football team. They maybe still do, Kansas City. And, they were fairly normal billionaires, it seems. But they were also one of the biggest funders of the John Birch Society in the United States. And my friend that went through the doors with me lived next door where I lived, a few blocks from the arena. And his father was the head of the North Dakota Petroleum Division of the State Geological Survey. You've probably heard about the latest oil strike in North Dakota. It's made the United States practically independent of foreign oil, along with the Texas, West Texas oil fields.
Mhm.
Well, as a kid, Bruce and I worked in what they call the core lab across the street from the arena where Kennedy spoke. And the core lab was where we would spend our summers taking rocks from drill holes in western North Dakota and putting them in boxes to function as a library for future oil companies coming in to drill. They could consult this library, huge building with lots of racks of these cores. So I was beginning to learn something about the oil industry that way. Well, Bruce's dad, Mr. Folsom, Bert Folsom, used to talk to us about H.L. Hunt, who he was pretty close to. And he would say, when I'd be in Bismarck, out in the center of the state, the capital, I'd meet with H.L. Hunt and I would try to get him to do lease paperwork so he could drill, hunt oil. And all he wanted to do is talk about killing Kennedy. This is 60, in the 50s, the first oil strike was 52 in North Dakota. So he's there leasing land to drill and meeting with my best friend's dad. And his dad reports that all he wants, he can't get him to do paperwork. He describes being in a hotel one night in Hunt's room, trying to get him to do paperwork. And Hunt just wants to rant about killing Kennedy. He said, his father says, I finally give up. I walk down the hallway to go to my room, and Hunt was legally blind by now. He said he didn't even know I left the room. And as I went into my room down the hallway, I could still hear him ranting about killing Kennedy. Well, some of this is out of sequence, but when I finally put two and two together and realized that Hunt was leasing land around a town called Stanley, North Dakota, where ostensibly Oswald appeared when he was about 15, 16 years old. John and I think he was simply, it was a setup by H.L. Hunt, or at least I think that part of it involved H.L. Hunt. So I went to the University of North Dakota Geological Survey, and I said, do you guys have all those cores available as a record? Oh yeah, we got them all computerized. They spit out every oil well drilled in 50 years, and all of the land around this town where Oswald appeared were leased by H.L. Hunt. Now, strangely enough, that county where Hunt had all this oil leasing going on, he was aware that people were so openly communist in that county. There were Finlanders, and lots of radical Finlanders settled in northern Minnesota and in northern North Dakota. Coal mining, strip mining in North Dakota, iron mining in Minnesota. And there were enough of them so they felt confident to even run for county commissioner as a communist. Well, you can imagine if Hunt is there, he's livid. He's, what's going on? You know, well, in his mind, it becomes a perfect place to frame Oswald, to set up a paper trail, even though it's 54 and 1956 when John and I got reports of Oswald being there. I told Peter Dale Scott this story, and he said, well, yeah, if those people were actually for real, or were they part of a unwitting participation in a plot? Not the Finns, but the people who were members of the John Birch Society and would be just totally upset with the communist leaning members of their community, which was only a couple of thousand people. So everybody knew everybody. So anyway, that's my best friend's dad, Mr. Folsom, would described going to Dallas and having dinner with Hunt at his house. The Hunt brothers and HL would show up at the geology department across the street from the arena, because all of the members of the geology department at UND, with the exception of one, were ultra-right. I don't know, sometimes that seems typical of oil men, conservative politics. And I got that from a professor in that geology department who said, I was the only liberal in that department. They were all to the right of Attila the Hun. So what I'm getting at here is you have a milieu of activity that when you throw H.L. Hunt's money into the mix, and the fact that Mr. Folsom, my best friend's dad, was a card-carrying member of the John Birch Society, along with many wealthy farmers around Grand Forks who were big donors to the John Birch Society. They would see Kennedy as a communist, pure and simple, and so would be willing to participate in some kind of a plot, it seems. Now, of course, that's speculation, but the point is the political background and context is there, but you had to corrupt the local police department, whether it be Dallas or Chicago, Miami. Well, the Grand Forks, North Dakota Police Department was corrupt. I knew a mayor who would come into the bar that I was bartending in once a week, and I don't know if you know what pull tabs are, but they're tickets that you open up, and if there's 3 oranges, you win $50, that kind of thing. He'd come in at the beginning of the week, there'd be a jar full of these that hadn't been bought yet. It was a fresh jar. He would open every one of them. There'd be a pile on the table. He was the mayor. Well, the mayor can do that. But then one night the manager told me that his racket was he would go to every club, Elks, Lions, Knights of Columbus, all these various service organizations, and he'd do the same thing every place. And they'd come back Monday with a receipt in order to be able to get a check from the local regional power company to pay his $200,000 a year gambling bill. So when they came to get rate increases in electrical rates to the city council, they'd give them the increase. So there was corruption. Now that's probably typical of many cities across, I won't include Europe or England, but across the United States.
Yeah, I'm sure we've got a share of corruption here, Gary.
Yeah. Do you want to have me say a few words about, I wish I knew how to get from one end of the slides quicker, but.
That's fine, Gary.
So, any other response at this point? Any glaring shortcomings?
You said that Hunt was ranting about Kennedy, and what was his big beef about it? Was it because he was a communist, or he saw him as a communist, or was there another reason? Was there, because obviously Kennedy was involved in trying to tighten up tax loopholes so that oil was an impact.
Depletion allowance.
Sorry, go ahead, Peter.
Wasn't it something to do with the oil depletion allowance?
That's it. Yeah.
Right.
And who was the guy? Remember, there's that thing about the guy who was taped by the FBI informant. Was that Hunt about having a shooter from a high office building or something?
Miltier.
It was Miltier. Ah, okay.
Yeah.
I remember he was a white-haired guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, Hunt.
Sorry, John.
So, strangely enough, Hunt got his start as a young 20-year-old around Grand Forks. There used to be these huge wheat fields, and during the Depression and other tight times, people would come from all over the country to work in these wheat fields, harvesting in the fall. And Hunt got into a poker game because he wanted to turn pro as a poker player, and he lost his rear end in this poker game. And the guy that beat him says, "Kid, go back to Arkansas or Texas and get an education because you ain't going to be a poker player." And that anecdote is told in some biography of Hunt that I picked up on someplace. And so he went back, and about that time, the big oil strike happened on the Texas-Arkansas border, and he was off and running. And but the point being, North Dakota was kind of on his radar from when he was in his 20s. And then he ends up there expanding his oil business into Western North Dakota. So not only was Hunt having experiences there at some point in his life, but this guy was kind of a child prodigy. He started college at 16. He was done by the time he was 19. Graduated in 1927 from University of North Dakota. He was a 1958 Sioux Award winner, which is the highest award that the university gives to graduates. He edited 600 consecutive issues of Life magazine from about 1940 to the 60s. He was the managing editor. In 62, he was kicked upstairs to just the editor. But for all those years, those 600 issues, he micromanaged Life magazine. I went to New York and interviewed his wife, his widow, for 6 hours at their apartment. And I should say condo. And I thought that if anybody had an original Zapruder film, it might be the editor at Life magazine. And she'd leave the room, and I thought, geez, what if the original Zapruder film was in that closet over there? You know. Finally, after about 4 hours, she says, "Do you want to see his retirement video at Life magazine?" So we go. She's about 75 years old at that point, a little younger than he would have been. He passed away in 95, and I'm interviewing her in about 2000. And she puts the videotape in the machine, and about 11 minutes in, after the narrator recounts Thompson's life as a kid in North Dakota, just about 40 miles north of Grand Forks, the narrator says, "Ed had finally arrived. He was hobnobbing with presidents," and it shows him walking down the street with Truman. And he was traveling in some pretty heady circles with MacArthur, and he published MacArthur's memoirs in Life magazine. But then at the 11-minute mark, just as the narrator said Ed had finally arrived, and it shows him jumping into the air like he's won the lottery, there were 3 loud, what I call like this. And I turned to her and I said, "What was that?" She says, "I don't know. It was like she was in a trance." "I don't know." I said, "Can I record that?" Well, the night before, my wife told me that I was going to get something I didn't expect. It wouldn't be the Zapruder film. And so I set up my tape recorder in front of the TV speaker, and she got up and walked over and pulled a duplicate of the videotape out of a pile and said, "Oh, here, you can have this." This is a story in itself. It's in the 4th decade in 2000. But, it just occurred to me the other day as I put this slideshow together. There he is in 1958 in Grand Forks getting this award. And you see that quote on the left there, "The masses need," this is Henry Luce talking. And the sentence before that I didn't include mentioned that Henry Luce was experimenting with fascism. Remember, his wife was the ambassador to Mussolini in the 30s. And so Luce says the masses needed a strong leader since they were incapable of really making a country function without one. In 1928, Edward K. Thompson was just finishing college, but 20 years later, just before he was promoted to managing editor, he told Luce in a memo that he believed that the model Luce envisioned for the world was his model too, fascism. This is, he ran Life magazine, and when he retired from Life, he put together the Smithsonian magazine. His wife was a communist. And he said in this book, I wish I had known more about Marxism after I divorced my first wife and spent the rest of my life with Lee Eitengang. Her family was Russian. Her father was put in prison in Moscow by Lenin, let out because he controlled the whole fur industry in Siberia, and moved to New York, and they needed him because of his deep pockets. But her family was responsible for the assassination of Trotsky.
Mexico City.
Pardon? Yeah, right.
Mexico City with a ice pick or something.
Right. And there's a whole series of documentation of their involvement. Now, were they doing that for the revolution or what? Now, the fascinating thing about Thompson, he leaves the University of North Dakota and goes to work for the newspaper in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. First year reporter, second year, he'd been at a small newspaper in North Dakota before he went to Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. And he's a stringer. He's writing short stories or short news pieces for Time magazine. So he's in touch. Now he had been in intelligence at Bletchley Park, which you all know.
Yep.
He produced the U.S. military's monthly military magazine. I forget the name of it. And he looks at the fact that Henry Luce is going to start a new magazine called Life, based on a lot of photographs mainly. And Thompson looks at the first issue and says, I can do better than that. So Luce hires him. Well, part of the reason Luce hired him was that Ed Thompson at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel perfected compositing of newspaper photos. He had a way to make a cut line that would make any picture that had been doctored invisible. Now, when I interviewed his wife for 6 hours, I didn't say anything about Kennedy. I just let her talk. And it was clear that she was far left. She somehow coexisted with him. She was on the plane to Tokyo when the cabinet had to turn around and go back to Hawaii when the message came across the radio that the president had been assassinated. She told me that story. She said Dean Rusk, Secretary of State or Defense, wanted him to become the ambassador to the Greek junta. So she said we were sitting in a hotel in Athens and he was meeting with the generals, and he came out and she says, I said to him, Ed, we do not belong here. And he didn't accept the job. But there again, he was interfacing with the fascist Greek junta. So, you know, it's a strange thing when you grow up in a place and you have this long history, and you discover that, for example, Clint Hill was born in Grand Forks. John Thunheim, about 40 miles away, who is in Minneapolis, and I have a chance to run a lot of this by him. And over the years. And Wesley Liebeler, not quite Grand Forks, but in that part of the state, who was one of the lead counsels on the Warren Commission. Good friend of David Lifton as a resource. And there were others that just pure coincidence, I'm sure, and but strange coincidences that, I mean, a lot of people leave North Dakota because, like I said, it's too damn cold. Some of them become famous. That's all there is to it, I guess. Oh, by the way, I had a few props that I should have shown at the beginning. When I retired 8 years ago from Kennedy High School, I was known to be teaching a lot about the assassination. I teach a unit 5 times a year. And so there's a food processor called the Single Bullet. They actually gave me one. So I took the box and framed it.
The magic bullet.
Magic Bullet Deluxe.
Yeah, very good.
And then my colleagues in my department actually put this together, which is a prized possession. It's the Warren Commission, and in between the members of the Warren Commission are all the staff members from Kennedy High School, and they stuck me up on the wall behind there. And the caption says, I'm pretty proud of this, "You've been found guilty of a conspiracy to capably educate a free-thinking American youth. This must result in a long and happy retirement." And at the bottom is Lee Harvey Oswald, Hoover, and my North Dakota hockey coach. Not sure why they put him in there.
3 dictators.
Right, there you go. So with that, I'm sure there's stuff I've forgotten, but I'll leave it at that. And if anybody...
Gary, I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
Your pal who you went through the doors with. Now, I missed the first 10, 15 minutes, sadly, because I wasn't well. So I might have missed it. But did you ever discuss all this with him afterwards or in recent years as such?
Yeah, like I say, we were best friends. And in the 70s, he moved to his mother's origin place in Texas, Wichita Falls, which is where Robert Oswald lived. And I ended up talking to Robert Oswald about this research, and Robert Oswald would just he'd listen. And I sent him a packet of material, called him back, and he said, just very interesting, no commitment. Yeah, at any rate, my friend, I see every year when I go to Dallas, if I get down there, sometimes I go down there for other reasons, and we meet. And he talks about the fact that his dad was a bircher. The first time, after many years of not connecting, I told him about my scenario here, and I'll never forget, he sat there and shivered, because there's things about his father that I think he knows that, of course, he's not going to tell anybody. But numerous times his memory is totally the same about the experience we had. And he's a poet. He's very, very sensitive and observant of people's character. And he had gone to the Navy in 1967. And while he was gone, I became his dad's surrogate son, living next door. And there was one occasion, especially sitting in the backyard, and my father had just died in 1965. And I had 6 kids overnight, because I was the oldest of 7, and they were from 3 months to 13 years old with no life insurance. So I was kind of blown away. And I think he maybe thought that maybe I had learned something from that experience about life. And he sat there in the backyard and said, "Gary, what's it all about?" And I'm thinking, you're asking me? You're 60 years old. And then he said, "You know, LBJ killed Kennedy." Now, this is 1967, 68. Never forgot that, because I knew that he had been close to Hunt, and Hunt was LBJ's sugar daddy. So did he know something about the plot that was being hatched in Grand Forks by right-wing Goldwaterites and Birchers? I mean, I knew all kinds of them. The kind of farm that Hunt worked on in the 20s and 30s, I knew the people who descended from those people, and man, I mean, they owned thousands of acres, and they funded the Birch Society at the national and local level. So my friend has never had a problem with any of that. He's quiet when it comes to talking about his dad's involvement. But I just saw him in November in Dallas. He drove in from Wichita Falls, and we spent 5-6 hours together. He had to go back, but yeah, we're in touch all the time. We call each other. Is that?
Thank you.
Yep. Anything else?
There is a comment here from David, actually, which is I'm just going to read out. Having recently finished Scott's Deep Politics and proud to use JFK, I'm struck by the observation that the US establishment, who all seem to be connected in some way, put an end to Nazism in Europe simply to transfer it back home, using anti-communism as a pretext for their actions thereafter. It's just going to say Gary's fascinating talk has only served to underline this at a local level. Thanks for that comment, David.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'll be 73 in June. The more I observe and synthesize life experiences, the more it seems to come into focus that for a lot of people, fascism is not something that they identify their value system to be a part of. It's just, they see it as, it's been normalized, let's put it that way.
Mm.
And so Mr. Trump continually says things that are going down that road, I think.
Again, what I'm going to do, everybody, I'm going to unmute everybody. So if you do want to make a comment or ask a question, please feel free to do so. I'm just going to unmute everybody. So you're all unmuted now. So just, really good to get your thoughts, get your comments, or any questions that people have.
Before I forget, go ahead.
Sorry, I don't have any questions, but it's been very interesting, Gary, certainly. These months leading up to the assassination, the more they're fleshed out as to what Kennedy was doing and the opportunities that were there for people to make an attempt on his life. It's interesting stuff.
Yeah, when I saw Paul Blue's articles in your journal, I didn't realize anybody had done that kind of in-depth look at the other possible plots. And we talked a few months ago, and I told him about this one, and it's below the radar. I mean, it is in the archives at Baylor University. It's in numerous places, the story, but it's not like anybody's going to find it that easily. Mm. So maybe this will be a piece of the puzzle. Before I forget, in response to the previous question, the idea that there's a process of bringing Nazism or fascism, we did, as you probably know, with Operation Paperclip, bring about 10,000 Nazis into the American government, whether it was Werner von Braun or ones that were invisible. So there's that. But when you look at the foreign policy structure in Washington back in the day and subsequently, there's my feeling is that even though there may have been all of these mafioso and corrupt oilmen involved, I still see the order coming from the national security state, the Dulleses and the Atchisons and people who could kind of dangle these puppets and look the other way as they saw what was happening, and it would be to their benefit, the benefit of the 1% power structure, to get rid of somebody like Kennedy who was going to take away their perks.
Yep.
So who's the University of Hartford professor that uses that term, false sponsors? Anyway, I think the danger with using false sponsors literally is that we take away participants who were so rabid in their anti-communism that they could be easily used by the real foreign policy structure.
Okay, are there any questions or any other comments?
Yes, Tony, I've got a question. I haven't, Gary, I haven't read Dick Russell's book, but I just really wanted to press you on Richard Case-Nagel. Just get your views on how credible you think that story is. I was listening to a podcast quite recently from another researcher, a guy called Carmine Savastano, and he felt that this was pretty much a story that lacked a great deal of documentation. He described him as an unstable character whose wife had left him homeless, living in a car. And he didn't really buy into the whole, Dick Russell line. As I said, I haven't read the book, so I can't, comment with too much credibility myself. But I just really wanted to understand what you thought about this whole guy and the story.
Sure. I listened to the same podcast recently, and I was in New Orleans, and so I didn't have access to Russell's book until I got home 24 hours ago. And luckily I'm in quarantine where my library is that you can see in the back there. I didn't want to get too close to the books because everybody would be trying to read the titles if I was too close and not hearing what I was saying. At any rate, I looked at Russell's book and I couldn't believe the discrepancies between Carmine his last name Stephanakis or Stefanos.
Savastano.
Yeah, Sevastano. Well, he's mainly talks about the document that he found, which was a police report of the actual arrest, and policeman Bundren, Bundren, in the police report seems to be saying that this couldn't be an attempt to get arrested, that in fact Nagel was really looking for a lot of money because he was down and out, and that's all it was. And I look at Russell's recounting of that scene, and I hadn't looked at it for years. I'd looked at the parts of the book about North Dakota. But Bundren, Russell says, verified Russell's description of the arrest. And it wasn't all what Stefanos did in the podcast. And so that was quite important, I think, in terms of really realizing that Dick Russell's story, in fact, Dick Russell went and talked to the policeman, and the policeman said, the way you describe it is what happened. Well, I hate to try to assassinate the messenger, but we know that when witnesses were corralled in 1963, they'd have their police reports changed into reports that didn't, and they would say, that isn't what I said. You know, whether we're talking Gene Hill standing on the curb or whatever, all kinds of people had their testimony distorted. Well, here we are 57 years later, and we get this reference to Bundren's police report and an accusation that Russell didn't report that. But if you look at Russell's book, he did report it. And in fact, Bundren said, no way was Nagel crazy or a mental patient, because anybody that could put together a legal defense like he did, doing all the paperwork, that was his reason for thinking that Nagel was totally sane. So, you know, maybe the truth is someplace in the middle, but I just think that it comes down on the side of Nagel being legitimate. You know, he didn't know where the assassination was going to take place in September. He thought it was Washington. But maybe the dates were actually what I experienced, almost. Does that help?
Yep, that's fine. Thank you. Yep.
Now, there were more context. Are people familiar with what happened in Wisconsin in terms of Oswald laying a paper trail through Wisconsin in summer of '63? Bill Weston, a Los Angeles researcher, actually was able to get a hold of a guy in Sparta, Wisconsin, where Oswald got a haircut, and the barber said that he noticed the mastoid scar by his ear, and Oswald was spouting pro-Russian stuff in the chair as he was having his haircut, but he missed the train. And so he had to stay overnight. So he got a haircut right in the hotel where he stayed. So I went there because Bill Weston in Los Angeles said, I'll ask the guy if he'll talk to you. And the guy was upset because Weston had told his story in the fourth decade, and he didn't want that kind of visibility. So my wife and I rolled in there one day, walked up to the barber shop, out to lunch, he says. We walk across the street to the restaurant. The waitress says, yeah, that's him over there. I didn't disturb him, went out in the street, out in the sidewalk. He came out. I said, I think it was Mr. Palmer. Could we talk to you about JFK? And he freaked out. He put his hand up in the air, trying to rush away from us. I won't talk about that. I won't talk about that. Well, you know, I wasn't going to follow him into the barber shop. But then, so that was in the summer of '63. Then another Oswald event was in northern Wisconsin, about 2 hours south of Ashland, where Kennedy landed and gave a speech, and they named the airport after him later. 2 hours away, Rhinelander, Wisconsin, Oswald shows up to buy a radio at a electronics store, just a mom and pop operation. And the woman describes Oswald, again, talking pro-Russian stuff. She says a woman like Marina is in the car, sitting in front of the store with a baby. It's hot. Oswald disappears, comes back a few hours later, decides to buy the radio, I think. So I talked to her, and she seemed way too enthusiastic about telling her story. And so these kinds of things I see, along with Stanley, North Dakota, as ostensibly attempts to lay paper trails so that if something happened in 60, 61, 62, 3, I mean, Kennedy was on the John Birch radar for probably all of the 50s and 60s. I mean, they knew him as a liberal congressman. that someday probably would have the resources to become president. And so, you know, for H.L. Hunt to be laying the paperwork in 54 and 56 in North Dakota is a little more of a stretch. But then when you see Wisconsin, you know, that's right before. I mean, maybe they were going to try to pull something in Duluth, and that's why they cleared out the 11th and 9th floors between Kennedy's room in case a bomb went off. So that's just, you know, like Paul Blue's essays in your last two journals. It's trying to flesh out what these other events were, and there's usually these kinds of contexts and extenuating circumstances that seem to fit the conservation tour also. Well, I've about, you know, I can keep going if anybody needs more perspective or.
Gary, just one question. You mentioned Vince Palamara earlier on. Did you ever speak to Vince? Of course, he was very well up on the Secret Service and some of the shortcomings that he was able to present to us at Canterbury some years ago. Did he ever comment on how the Secret Service operated in North Dakota that day? Did he ever talk to you about it?
Well, we talked. I mean, that's when he gave me the information about the night of September 25th and the White House agreeing. You know, I basically told him the things I've told you, maybe not as extensively. And, but as far as how they were I don't think he had much information about the conservation tour. At least he didn't volunteer anything, even after I described what happened in terms of security in my experience. So, you know, we still connect now and then, and that's about all I can say to that.
Okay, thanks, Gary.
Thank you. Anybody heard of the Winnipeg Airport incident?
Mhm.
That happened in '64, and there was a guy sitting in the airport restaurant who heard two guys sitting next to him talking about the assassination, and he claims one of them was David Ferry, who was wearing shorts as if he wasn't planning on leaving the airport, as cold as it is in Winnipeg, and as if there was a payoff in, not that the man in Winnipeg who happened to be in the restaurant saw any money exchange hands, but Peter Whitney in Vancouver, BC is the person that dug deepest into that. And it was a big story in Winnipeg and the Winnipeg Free Press over the years. And Richard Giesbrecht was the person that witnessed this meeting. And so again, you know, why Winnipeg? Why Grand Forks? Why the two coldest places on the planet? Sometimes I think that's where this whole thing would be least visible. It's not a place, like John Williams said on one occasion, it's not a place you'd visit for a vacation. So it was really at the end of the road, so to speak. So Winnipeg itself has quite an ultra-right history. Again, a lot of Russian Ukrainian immigrants settled there, and they even had a mayor that was a communist. Just a very cosmopolitan place, about 800,000 people. And I went there as a kid a lot, and so I had a sense of it. I was in the restaurant where this Richard Giesbrecht recounted the meeting that he saw, supposedly with David Ferry. And when I went in there in about 1970, just because I was curious about airports, I went into the restaurant and I thought, wait a minute, this looks like a mob hangout. Dark, smoky.
It's 6 o'clock.
Guys hanging out with white ties and black shirts and sunglasses. And there was a large Sicilian mafia contingent living in Winnipeg because Italy kicked them out, kicked hundreds of thousands of mafioso out of Italy in 1950s or so. I think 400,000 went to Montreal, 200,000 to Toronto, and 50,000 to Winnipeg. And I've been in that section of the city, and you'd think you were in Italy, just the language that you hear. Anyway, interesting place. Right in my backyard.
Listen, Gary, I'm just going to wrap it up there because this has been terrific. It's been a 2-hour session, and everybody, I think, has really enjoyed it. And I'm sure that everyone wants to pass on their sincere thanks to Gary. It's been fantastic. But one thing I would like to ask, not of yourself actually, Gary. John, are you still there? John Williams, yeah?
Yes, I'm right here.
John, one of the things that you were doing just before we started, you were talking about your book, and I'm aware that a number of people may have joined this meeting and may have missed that discussion. And I'm also aware that, unfortunately, I beg your pardon, I may have cut you off as I was welcoming people into the session. So before we go, can you talk a little bit about your book, which is called Lee Harvey Oswald's Lyndon Johnson, the John F. Kennedy Assassination? I've put links to it in the chat area so people can actually link to the Amazon site. Do you want to just talk about that a little bit before we wrap up?
Yeah, I put the link to the Amazon UK site.
Brilliant. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah. Okay. It's something I spent. I have well, I started really getting involved with the JFK things back in. Well, we went to Dealey Plaza in 1980, and I've been pretty much involved ever since. But I didn't write a word until about 1998. And I had some things along with Gary in the 4th decade. But I had followed it. I have no idea how many books I have on the JFK assassination. Basically, it's a book that I wrote about the things I've learned over the years and the people I've met. I've run into, like, for example, Gary and I interviewed Madeleine Brown. Actually, it turned out to be just 6 months before she died. So also I've we got involved with the fellow, let me just see if I can, from Russia, Ernst Titovitz, yeah. And also with, actually earlier in a JFK research thing, Judith Baker. And so between the two of them, it really patches over a lot of missing time. And for example, in Russia from 1959 to 62, or actually 1960 to 62, the interactions with Titovitz. And that also includes the work, the book on the Man Who Knew Too Much, and his interactions with Oswald. And it gives a much broader picture of Oswald in all of this than I think I've seen anywhere else. But one other thing that's very different about the book is it doesn't end with the assassination. I take it all the way through the JFK, not JFK, LBJ presidency. And and in doing that, I learned a lot about LBJ that, and some of it, by the way, I had published in the Dealey Plaza Echo. It's kind of like my life's work on JFK. And of course, I don't come up with the actual assassin. I'll tell you that. But I guess it's my writing down the things that I've found important. And I think a lot of it is different than you've seen other places. And so that's kind of an overview. It actually ends, the last chapter is the continuing cover-up. And there's a fellow, and I got to look up his name. I'd never heard of him before, but he wrote a book. His name was, I think, Robert Fulton.
That's right.
Yeah. And he wrote a book about the watch that JFK was wearing at the time of the assassination. And he ended up buying that watch from someone, and then had it and sold it at auction. And the presumed buyer was JFK Jr. For having owned that watch, he spent 7.5 years in prison, and in federal prison in the United States. And his life was totally upended. While he was in prison, his wife died and he didn't know about it. So it gives a sweeping, I start in 1962, actually 1963, at the speech he gave at the commencement in the peace speech, and take it right up through LBJ, including actually after that, when Nixon was trying to get LBJ to help him get out of the process of him being removed as president. And LBJ said, actually, if I were going to do anything, I'd help him get you. And that actually to the end of his life. So that's kind of an overview of it. It's I think it's very interesting. By the way, one thing that's happened with it, this is not it has become a bestseller among my high school graduating class of 1956. And almost all of my fellow students have read it, and so it's kind of interesting. But
it's certainly interesting to us, John. Thank you very much for that.
Okay.
Tony.
Yeah, Bart.
It's Gary.
Sorry, Gary. Go ahead. Sorry, Gary.
Thanks for that, John. It's well worth reading.
Well, let me say one more thing. The foreword is written by Gary.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. My first foreword I've ever written. At any rate, this picture that involves Mr. Thompson and his compositing skills. Lee Rankin, the chief counsel of the Warren Commission, had to request that Thompson send the original negatives to the Warren Commission 4 times. And the 4th time, Rankin said, if you don't have it to us by 4 o'clock, I think it was April something, we're going to be very upset. Obviously they couldn't threaten him with jail, but so Thompson turns in the negative, and I've seen the memo from Rankin, and Thompson responds by saying, Okay, yeah, fine. Sorry I didn't get it to you sooner. All I did was touch up the picture around his pant leg, around the butt of the rifle, around his shoulder, and around his neck. Seems to me a limited hangout. I didn't put his head on somebody else's body. He didn't say that, but that seemed to be where that comment was going.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Gary, again, can I just pass on my sincere thanks from every one of us. This is the first time we've done this webinar, and you've been amazing. And thanks for your patience with us.
Yeah, thanks, Gary.
Big thanks. It's been really, really interesting, and yeah, thank you very much. You know, really appreciate that.
Thank
John,
you
very
John,
much.
information about your book. It looks brilliant, and I'm sure that's going to be of interest to us.
Thank you very much for letting this extended rant go on.
No, we like ranting. That's what we do.
All right.
We do, as long as we're not, it doesn't end by being encouraged to drink bleach. Yes, we do.
Well,
That's type of rants we can do without.
Yeah, I've got some Clorox chewables I got to get to here.
Okay, everybody, thanks a lot for coming along. Just before we finish, I'm going to email out the list of Ian Griggs' books that his son Steve sent out to us. A number of people have expressed an interest in a number of those books. And again, just to reiterate, Steve doesn't want any money for the books. Just he wants to get rid of them to a good home. So it's just a cost of postage and packing. I'll email out a list with all the people who have expressed an interest. And then if I can ask you to just, you know, if you haven't expressed an interest, please do so. And I'll probably send it off to Steve next week. Details. The next week that we have plans. The next meeting that we have planned, by the way, is August the 1st. And I think this has gone really, really well. And again, million thanks, Gary. We will, I'm sure, do another one on the 1st of August. Go ahead, Bart.
We'll have one sooner.
Sooner than better, or earlier than August, yeah.
Why not?
Well, be sure to include me.
Yeah.
And we've got, hopefully, we're going to do this on a monthly basis because the technology allows us to do this. So, and it just went pretty flawless. So, as far as I'm concerned, if the interest is there, then we can do this every month or otherwise every 2 months. It's up to the member base, what everyone thinks.
And certainly for me, I mean, I think we've had 17 participants on the call.
Yeah.
The webinar, which I think has been good because usually we're getting about 12 people attending our physical meeting. So it's great that people who, you know, couldn't attend in person can now attend through this. So I think, you know, Bart, myself and Stuart were talking about this. And even when things, touch wood, do return to normal, I think this is now going to be a regular feature of all of our meetings. We're going to make it available to everybody to access through Zoom. And then hopefully, well, people can join even though they can't.
Yeah.
Great.
Great stuff.
Okay.
Well, it's supper time for you guys.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Tony, for organizing. I'm going to leave the meeting and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, Bart, thanks a lot,
All
mate.
right.
Appreciate that.
Thanks, Bart.
Have a good one. Thanks a lot, Gary.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye,
Thank you.
John. Bye. Bye.
Okay, well, thanks everyone, and thanks very much, Gary. Really interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks, and Tony, for organising.
No problem.
Cheers now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Now.
Bye.
Bye now.
Cheers time. Bye.
Sorry, John, were you going to say? Okay.
Which John?
Sorry, there's John.
Yeah.
I do love that picture on your. You can stop sharing your screen now. Actually, we can just end the meeting anyway. And actually, what I'll do is I'll just stop the recording, so it's all good.